Agatha Christie, The Oracle at Delphi. Mrs. Willard J. Peters did not really care for Greece, and of Delphi she had, in her secret heart, no opinion at all. Mrs. Peters's spiritual homes were Paris, London, and the Riviera. She was a woman who enjoyed hotel life, but her idea of a hotel bedroom was a soft pile carpet, a luxurious bed, a profusion of different arrangements of electric light, including a shaded bedside lamp, plenty of hot and cold water, and a telephone beside the bed, by means of which you could order tea, meals, mineral waters, cocktails, and speak to your friends. In the hotel at Delphi there were none of these things. There was a marvellous view from the windows, the bed was clean, and so was the whitewashed room. There was a chair, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. Baths took place by arrangement, and were occasionally disappointing as regarded hot water. It would, she supposed, be nice to say that you had been to Delphi, and Mrs. Peters had tried hard to take an interest in ancient Greece, but she found it difficult. Their statuary seemed so unfinished, so lacking in heads and arms and legs. Secretly, she much preferred the handsome marble angel complete with wings which was erected on the late Mr. Willard Peters' tomb. But all these secret opinions she kept carefully to herself, for fear her son Willard should despise her. It was for Willard's sake that she was here, in this chilly and uncomfortable room, with a sulky maid and a disgusted chauffeur in the offing. For Willard, until recently called Junior, a title which he hated, was Mrs. Peters's 18-year-old son, and she worshipped him to distraction. It was Willard who had this strange passion for bygone art. It was Willard, thin, pale, spectacled and dyspeptic, who had dragged his adoring mother on this tour through Greece. They had been to Olympia, which Mrs. Peters thought a sad mess. She had enjoyed the Parthenon, but she considered Athens a hopeless city. And a visit to Corinth and Mycenae had been agony to both her and the chauffeur. Delphi, Mrs. Peters thought unhappily, was the last straw. Absolutely nothing to do but walk along the road and look at the ruins. Willard spent long hours on his knees deciphering Greek inscriptions, saying, "Mother, just listen to this. Isn't it splendid?" And he would then read out something that seemed to Mrs. Peters the quintessence of dullness. This morning Willard had started early to see some Byzantine mosaics. Mrs. Peters, feeling instinctively that Byzantine mosaics would leave her cold, in the literal as well as the spiritual sense, had excused herself. "I understand, Mother," Willard had said. "You want to be alone, just to sit in the theatre or up in the stadium and look down over it all and let it sink in." "That's right, pet," said Mrs. Peters. "I knew this place would get you," said Willard exultantly, and departed. Now, with a sigh, Mrs. Peters prepared to rise and breakfast. She came into the dining room to find it empty save for 4 people. A mother and daughter, dressed in what seemed to Mrs. Peters a most peculiar style, not recognizing the peplum as such, who were discoursing on the art of self-expression in dancing, a plump, middle-aged gentleman who had rescued a suitcase for her when she got off the train and whose name was Thompson, and a newcomer, a middle-aged gentleman with a bald head, who had arrived on the preceding evening. This personage was the last left in the breakfast room, and Mrs. Peters soon fell into conversation with him. She was a friendly woman, and liked someone to talk to. Mr. Thompson had been distinctly discouraging in manner, British Reserve Mrs. Peters called it, and the mother and daughter had been very superior and highbrow, though the girl had got on rather well with Willard. Mrs. Peters found the newcomer a very pleasant person. He was informative without being highbrow. He told her several interesting, friendly little details about the Greeks, which made her feel much more as though they were real people, and not just tiresome history out of a book. Mrs. Peters told her new friend all about Willard, and what a clever boy he was, and how culture might be said to be his middle name. There was something about this benevolent and bland personage which made him easy to talk to. What he himself did and what his name was, Mrs. Peters did not learn. Beyond the fact that he had been travelling, and that he was having a complete rest from business, what business? He was not communicative about himself. Altogether, the day passed more quickly than might have been anticipated. The mother and daughter and Mr. Thompson continued to be unsociable. They encountered the latter coming out of the museum, and he immediately turned in the opposite direction. Mrs. Peters' new friend looked after him with a little frown. "Now, I wonder who that fellow is," he said. Mrs. Peters supplied him with the other's name, but could do no more. Thompson. No, I don't think I've met him before, and yet somehow or other his face seems familiar. But I can't place him. In the afternoon, Mrs. Peters enjoyed a quiet nap in a shady spot. The book she took with her to read was not the excellent one on Grecian art recommended to her by her son, but was, on the contrary, entitled The River Launch Mystery. It had 4 murders in it, 3 abductions, and a large and varied gang of dangerous criminals. Mrs. Peters found herself both invigorated and soothed by the perusal of it. It was 4 o'clock when she returned to the hotel. Willard, she felt sure, would be back by this time. So far was she from any presentiment of evil that she almost forgot to open a note, which the proprietor said had been left for her by a strange man during the afternoon. It was an extremely dirty note. Idly she ripped it open. As she read the first few lines, her face blanched, and she put out a hand to steady herself. The handwriting was foreign, but the language employed was English. "Lady," it began, "this to hand to inform you that your son is being held captive by us in place of great security. No harm shall happen to honoured young gentlemen if you obey orders of yours truly. We demand for him ransom of 10,000 English pounds sterling. If you speak of this to hotel proprietor or police or any such person, your son will be killed. This is given you to reflect. Tomorrow directions in way of paying money will be given. If not obeyed, the honoured young gentleman's ears will be cut off and sent you. And following day, if still not obeyed, he will be killed. Again, this is not idle threat. Let the courier reflect, and above all, be silent. Demetrius the Black-Browed. It were idle to describe the poor lady's state of mind. Preposterous and childishly worded as the demand was, it yet brought home to her a grim atmosphere of peril. Willard, her boy, her pet, her delicate, serious Willard. She would go at once to the police. She would rouse the neighbourhood. But perhaps, if she did. She shivered. Then, rousing herself, she went out of her room in search of the hotel proprietor, the sole person in the hotel who could speak English. "It is getting late," she said. "My son has not returned yet." The pleasant little man beamed at her. "True. Monsieur dismissed the mules. He wished to return on foot. He should have been here by now, but doubtless he has lingered on the way." He smiled happily. "Tell me," said Mrs. Peters abruptly, "have you any bad characters in the neighbourhood?" Bad characters was a term not embraced by the little man's knowledge of English. Mrs. Peters made her meaning plainer. She received in reply an assurance that all around Delphi were very good, very quiet people, all well disposed towards foreigners. Words trembled on her lips, but she forced them back. That sinister threat tied her tongue. It might be the merest bluff. But suppose it wasn't? A friend of hers in America had had a child kidnapped, and on her informing the police, the child had been killed. Such things did happen. She was nearly frantic. What was she to do? £10,000, what was that? Between $40,000 or $50,000? What was that to her in comparison with Willard's safety? But how could she obtain such a sum? There were endless difficulties just now as regarded money and the drawing of cash. A letter of credit for a few £100s was all she had with her. Would the bandits understand this? Would they be reasonable? Would they wait? When her maid came to her, she dismissed the girl fiercely. A bell sounded for dinner, and the poor lady was driven to the dining room. She ate mechanically. She saw no one. The room might have been empty as far as she was concerned. With the arrival of fruit, a note was placed before her. She winced, but the handwriting was entirely different from that which she had feared to see, a neat, clerkly English hand. She opened it without much interest, but she found its contents intriguing. "At Delphi, you can no longer consult the oracle," so it ran, "but you can consult Mr. Parker Pyne." Below that was a cutting of an advertisement pinned to the paper, and at the bottom of the sheet a passport photograph was attached. It was the photograph of her bald-headed friend of the morning. Mrs. Peters read the printed cutting twice. "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne." Happy. Happy. Had anyone ever been so unhappy? It was like an answer to prayer. Hastily, she scribbled on a loose sheet of paper she happened to have in her bag. "Please help me. Will you meet me outside the hotel in 10 minutes? She enclosed it in an envelope and directed the waiter to take it to the gentleman at the table by the window. 10 minutes later, enveloped in a fur coat, for the night was chilly, Mrs. Peters went out of the hotel and strolled slowly along the road to the ruins. Mr. Parker Pyne was waiting for her. "It's just the mercy of heaven you're here," said Mrs. Peters breathlessly. "But how did you guess the terrible trouble I'm in? That's what I want to know." "The human countenance, my dear madam," said Mr. Parker Pyne gently. "I knew at once that something had happened, but what it is I am waiting for you to tell me." Out it came in a flood. She handed him the letter, which he read by the light of his pocket torch. He said. "A remarkable document. A most remarkable document. It has certain points." But Mrs. Peters was in no mood to listen to a discussion of the finer points of the letter. What was she to do about Willard? Her own dear, delicate Willard. Mr. Parker Pyne was soothing. He painted an attractive picture of Greek bandit life. They would be especially careful of their captive, since he represented a potential gold mine. Gradually, he calmed her down. "But what am I to do?" wailed Mrs. Peters. "Wait till tomorrow," said Mr. Parker Pyne. "That is, unless you prefer to go straight to the police." Mrs. Peters interrupted him with a shriek of terror. Her darling Willard would be murdered out of hand. "You think I'll get Willard back safe and sound?" "There is no doubt of that," said Mr. Parker Pyne soothingly. "The only question is whether you can get him back without paying £10,000. All I want is my boy." Yes, said Mr. Parker Pyne soothingly. "Who brought the letter, by the way?" "A man the landlord didn't know. A stranger." "Ah, there are possibilities there. The man who brings the letter tomorrow might be followed. What are you telling the people at the hotel about your son's absence?" "I haven't thought." "I wonder now." Mr. Parker Pyne reflected. "I think you might quite naturally express alarm and concern at his absence. A search party could be sent out." "You don't think these fiends—" she choked. No. So long as there is no word of the kidnapping or the ransom, they cannot turn nasty. After all, you can't be expected to take your son's disappearance with no fuss at all. Can I leave it all to you?" "That is my business," said Mr. Parker Pyne. They started back towards the hotel again, but almost ran into a burly figure. "Who was that?" asked Mr. Parker Pyne sharply. "I think it was Mr. Thompson." "Oh," said Mr. Parker Pyne thoughtfully. "Thompson, was it? Thompson. Mrs. Peters felt as she went to bed that Mr. Parker Pyne's idea about the letter was a good one. Whoever brought it must be in touch with the bandits. She felt consoled, and fell asleep much sooner than she could ever have believed possible. When she was dressing on the following morning, she suddenly noticed something lying on the floor by the window. She picked it up, and her heart missed a beat. The same dirty, cheap envelope, the same hateful characters. She tore it open. "Good morning, lady. Have you made reflections? Your son is well and unharmed, so far. But we must have the money. It may not be easy for you to get this sum, but it has been told us that you have with you a necklace of diamonds. Very fine stones. We will be satisfied with that instead. Listen, this is what you must do. You, or anyone you choose to send, must take this necklace and bring it to the stadium. From there, go up to where there is a tree by a big rock. Eyes will watch and see that only one person comes. Then your son will be exchanged for necklace. The time must be tomorrow, 6 o'clock in morning, just after sunrise. If you put police on us afterwards, we shoot your son as your car drives to station. This is our last word, lady. If no necklace tomorrow morning, your son's ears sent you. Next day he die. With salutations, lady. Demetrius." Mrs. Peters hurried to find Mr. Parker Pyne. He read the letter attentively. "Is this true?" he asked. "About a diamond necklace?" "Absolutely. $100,000 my husband paid for it." "Our well-informed thieves," murmured Mr. Parker Pyne. "What's that you say?" "I was just considering certain aspects of the affair." "My word, Mr. Pyne, we haven't got time for aspects. I've got to get my boy back." "But you are a woman of spirit, Mrs. Peters. Do you enjoy being bullied and cheated out of £10,000? Do you enjoy giving up your diamonds meekly to a set of ruffians?" "Well, of course, if you put it like that." The woman of spirit in Mrs. Peters wrestled with the mother. "How I'd like to get even with them. The cowardly brutes. The very minute I get my boy back, Mr. Pyne, I shall set the whole police of the neighbourhood on them, and if necessary I shall hire an armoured car to take Willard and myself to the railway station." Mrs. Peters was flushed and vindictive. "Yes," said Mr. Parker Pyne. "You see, my dear madam, I'm afraid they will be prepared for that move on your part. They know that once Willard is restored to you, nothing will keep you from setting the whole neighbourhood on the alert, which leads one to suppose that they have prepared for that move. Well, what do you want to do?" Mr. Parker Pyne smiled. "I want to try a little plan of my own." He looked round the dining room. It was empty, and the doors at both ends were closed. "Mrs. Peters, there is a man I know in Athens, a jeweller. He specializes in good artificial diamonds, first-class stuff." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'll get him by telephone. He can get here this afternoon, bringing a good selection of stones with him." "You mean?" "He'll extract the real diamonds and replace them with paste replicas." "Why, if that isn't the cutest thing I've ever heard of." Mrs. Peters gazed at him with admiration. "Shh, not so loud. Will you do something for me?" "Surely." "See that nobody comes within earshot of the telephone." Mrs. Peters nodded. The telephone was in the manager's office, who vacated it obligingly after having helped Mr. Parker Pyne to obtain the number. When he emerged, he found Mrs. Peters outside. "I'm just waiting for Mr. Parker Pyne," she said. "We're going for a walk." "Oh, yes, madam." Mr. Thompson was also in the hall. He came towards them and engaged the manager in conversation. Were there any villas to be let in Delphi? No? But surely there was one above the hotel. "That belongs to a Greek gentleman, monsieur. He does not let it." "And there are no other villas?" "There is one belonging to an American lady, that on the other side of the village. It is shut up now. And there is one belonging to an English gentleman, an artist. That one is on the cliff edge looking down to Itea." Mrs. Peters broke in. Nature had given her a lot of voice, and she purposely made it louder. "Why?" she said. "I'd just adore to have a villa here. So unspoiled and natural. I'm simply crazy about the place, aren't you, Mr. Thompson? But of course you must be if you want a villa. Is it your first visit here? You don't say so." She ran on determinedly till Mr. Parker Pyne emerged from the office. He gave her just the faintest smile of approval. Mr. Thompson walked slowly down the steps and out into the road, where he joined the highbrow mother and daughter, who seemed to be feeling the wind cold on their exposed arms. All went well. The jeweller arrived just before dinner with a car full of other tourists. Mrs. Peters took her necklace to his room. He grunted approval. Then he spoke in French. "Madame peut rester tranquille. Je réussirai." He extracted some tools from his little bag and began work. At 11 o'clock, Mr. Parker Pyne tapped on Mrs. Peters' door. "Here you are." He handed her a little chamois bag. She glanced inside. "My diamonds!" "Hush. Here is the necklace with the paste replacing the diamonds. Pretty good, don't you think?" "Simply wonderful. Aristobulus is a clever fellow." "You don't think they'll suspect?" "How should they? They know you have the necklace with you. You hand it over. How can they suspect the trick?" "Well, I think it's wonderful," Mrs. Peters reiterated, handing the necklace back to him. "Will you take it to them, or is that asking too much of you?" "Certainly I will take it. Just give me the letter, so that I have the directions clear. Thank you. Now, good night and bon courage. Your boy will be with you tomorrow for breakfast." "Oh, if only that's true." "Now don't worry. Leave everything in my hands." Mrs. Peters did not spend a good night. When she slept, she had terrible dreams. Dreams where armed bandits in armored cars fired off a fusillade at William, who was running down the mountain in his pyjamas. She was thankful to wake. At last came the first glitter of dawn. Mrs. Peters got up and dressed. She sat up, waiting. At 7 o'clock there came a tap on her door. Her throat was so dry she could hardly speak. "Come in," she said. The door opened and Mr. Thompson entered. She stared at him. Words failed her. She had a sinister presentiment of disaster, and yet his voice when he spoke was completely natural and matter-of-fact. It was a rich, bland voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Peters," he said. "How dare you, sir? How dare you?" "You must excuse my unconventional visit at so early an hour," said Mr. Thompson. "But you see, I have a matter of business to transact." Mrs. Peters leaned forward with accusing eyes. "So it was you who kidnapped my boy. It wasn't bandits at all." "It certainly wasn't bandits. Most unconvincingly done, that part of it, I thought. Inartistic, to say the least of it." Mrs. Peters was a woman of a single idea. "Where is my boy?" she demanded with the eyes of an angry tigress. "As a matter of fact," said Mr. Thompson, "he is just outside the door." "Willard!" The door was flung open. Willard, sallow and spectacled and distinctly unshaven, was clasped to his mother's heart. Mr. Thompson stood looking benignly on. "All the same," said Mrs. Peters, suddenly recovering herself and turning on him, "I'll have the law on you for this. Yes, I will." "You've got it all wrong, Mother," said Willard. "This gentleman rescued me." "Where were you?" "In a house on the cliff point, just a mile from here." "And allow me, Mrs. Peters," said Mr. Thompson, "to restore your property." He handed her a small packet loosely wrapped in tissue paper. The paper fell away and revealed the diamond necklace. "You need not treasure that other little bag of stones, Mrs. Peters," said Mr. Thompson, smiling. "The real stones are still in the necklace. The chamois bag contains some excellent imitation stones. As your friend said, Aristobulus is quite a genius." "I just don't understand a word of all this," said Mrs. Peters faintly. "You must look at the case from my point of view," said Mr. Thompson. "My attention was caught by the use of a certain name. I took the liberty of following you and your fat friend out of doors, and I listened, I admit it frankly, to your exceedingly interesting conversation. I found it remarkably suggestive, so much so that I took the manager into my confidence. He took a note of the number to which your plausible friend telephoned, and he also arranged that a waiter should listen to your conversation in the dining room this morning. The whole scheme worked out very clearly. You were being made the victim of a couple of clever jewel thieves. They know all about your diamond necklace. They follow you here. They kidnap your son and write the rather comic bandit letter, and they arrange that you shall confide in the chief instigator of the plot. After that, all is simple. The good gentleman hands you a bag of imitation diamonds and clears out with his pal. This morning, when your son did not appear, you would be frantic. The absence of your friend would lead you to believe that he had been kidnapped too. I gather that they had arranged for someone to go to the villa tomorrow. That person would have discovered your son, and by the time you and he had put your heads together, you might have got an inkling of the plot, but by that time, the villains would have got an excellent start. And now? Oh, now they are safely under lock and key. I arranged for that. The villain, said Mrs. Peters, wrathfully remembering her own trustful confidences. The oily, plausible villain. Not at all a nice fellow, agreed Mr. Thompson. It beats me how you got onto it, said Willard admiringly. Pretty smart of you. The other shook his head deprecatingly. No, no, he said. When you are travelling incognito and hear your own name being taken in vain. Mrs. Peters stared at him. Who are you? She demanded abruptly. I am Mr. Parker Pyne, explained that gentleman,